Well, it's a great pleasure to welcome back to the Kennedy Center Mr. Robert D. Griffiths, who currently serves as Counselor for Economic Affairs at the U.S. Embassy in Bangkok and also is the permanent representative for the Economic and Social Council for Asia Pacific for the United States. Robert Griffiths is joined the Foreign Service in 1983 as a consular officer and began his career in Bogota, Colombia. And throughout his 26-year career, he has served abroad in Europe, Thailand, Taipei, Shanghai, and Beijing, and at home in Washington, D.C. Before joining the Foreign Service, he served for several years as a foreign policy analyst in the Office of the Secretary of Defense at the Pentagon. We're very honored and pleased to claim him as a BYU alum, graduating with a bachelor's degree in Asian Studies. He also received a master's degree in public policy from Harvard University. He brings a very important perspective here to the Kennedy Center today, speaking on the global economic crisis, implications for U.S. leadership in Asia. I should also mention that this afternoon at 3 o'clock in this room, he will be conducting an informal discussion on careers in the Foreign Service. So for those of you who are thinking about this very interesting and exciting career option, we know quite a few BYU alum as well as Latter-day Saints who serve in the Foreign Service. We're very fortunate to welcome them. We jokingly say that July is Foreign Service Month because so many officers are passing through on home leave. But we're especially gratified to have Mr. Griffiths here today speaking on a topic that we seem to hear a lot about, I think perhaps only superseded by H1N1. So please join me in welcoming Mr. Robert D. Griffiths.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. Before we get started, let me make just a couple of notes. First of all, I'm required to make clear that what I'm going to say today represents my personal views. I'm not here officially representing the State Department, and nor are my records officially on the record for any press purposes. Also, I'd like to mention that I'm going to speak about a number of topics today in which I don't claim a great depth of personal expertise, but I think the value that I might add is to share how these issues are viewed from Asia and have that help inform our understanding of the issue globally. Finally, as was noted, I'd be happy to take questions at the end of it. I would consider my remarks most successful here today if they are the beginning of discussion, not the end of it. And just one last thing on a personal note. The last time I spoke here, I was speaking about the Foreign Service and our family growing up in it, and recognized my children in the audience at that point, which subsequently proved sort of embarrassing to them. So I want to let them know today that I will not do that today, and that would be Chelsea, Andrea, and Stephen. So, with everybody's mind at ease. The topic I'd like to try and address today is the global economic crisis, the impact of on U.S. leadership in Asia. First of all, let me review briefly what I think we all know about the crisis itself, about the financial crisis. We now know sort of began with a recession in the United States that began in December 2007. Gradually, housing prices were dropping. This precipitated initially a collapse of a major investment firm, Bear Stearns, in March of 2008, 2008. And then things continued to get a little more dicey until September of 2007 when we had a major catastrophe, and that the collapse of Lehman Brothers and the rest of the investment banking industry. I would argue that this is probably unprecedented. You had these huge, well-regarded firms, Bear Stearns, Merrill Lynch, Lehman Brothers, any of which any student at BYU would have loved to have a job interview with, 2 years ago, even almost 1 year ago. And they're gone. An entire industry is gone. Those two firms, I think, that remain, Goldman Sachs and one other, have transformed themselves into something other than an investment bank. An entire industry is gone. Overseas, we're always trying to get access to leadership, to the top leaders in government. And even though we're the United States and do fairly well compared to other countries, we never could do as well as New York investment bankers. They came to town, the Prime Minister will see them right off the bat. They were considered, I think, the smartest people on the face of the earth. And today, they're looked at almost as purveyors of Dr. John's snake oil. You know, it's a dramatic change in the collapse of an industry that the United States had been at the leading edge of. Okay, well, you have the financial crisis and the collapse of that. That very quickly led to an economic crisis. The fear among all banking institutions was, okay, with the collapse of these firms, who was holding their paper? Who was counting on them to repay their debts that may not be able to now? And that fear dried up the credit markets. The credit oil that is needed to make the economy move was not there. The economy began to grind to a halt. Interestingly, the financial crisis itself had little impact in Asia because most of the countries there outside of Japan had already instituted a number of reforms because of their experience in the Asian financial crisis of 1997 that prevented them from having a great deal of exposure to foreign debt. Well, the economic collapse continued to roll around the world. U.S. GDP figures, GDP dropped 5 to 6%. That's year on year, I believe, as of January. Exports were way off. In Asia and in other parts of the world, the economic crisis is much more severe than it is in the United States. Exports are a much larger percentage of the economy in other countries. In the United States, exports account for about 13% of GDP. In Thailand, for example, where I am now, they account for 70% of GDP. And the exports in the United States have dropped 16%. Well, in Thailand, when they're 70% of GDP, they've dropped 25%. In Japan, they've dropped 35%. In Singapore, they've dropped 40%. In Taiwan, they've dropped 44%. This is huge. Nothing like this has really ever happened in the history of the modern world, in economic terms, absent a major war. That's what's going on right now in the world's economy. And again, the effects, as bad as they are in the United States, and we're not at the end of it by any means, are much more severe in Asia and even more particularly in Eastern Europe. Okay, well, with all this terrible stuff going around, the natural inclination is to blame somebody. Well, who might we blame? Why did this happen? How did it happen? This will be debated for a long time, and if you could ever state it definitively, you'd make a lot of money with your book. But let me suggest 4 areas in which, again, from the perspective that I have in Asia, seems to be major contributors to the problem. First, irresponsible debt accumulation by consumers, particularly in the United States, but not only in the United States, and particularly involved in taking on more debt for housing than they could really afford. This was really sort of a transformation because mortgage investments had always been considered rather conservative and not very exciting, not high returns, because people tended to buy homes to live in and invest in and were very solid repayers of their debt because they didn't want to lose their house. Well, what happened in the 10 years preceding the crisis was that housing prices were going up so fast in many parts of the country that people began to buy houses for other reasons. In particular, they bought them as investments. Bought them, take on a huge mortgage, maybe an interest-only mortgage, plan to move out after 2 or 3 years and make a killing on the profit and move on. So mortgages changed their nature. And with that opportunity, then companies began to come up with more and more creative financial instruments to take advantage of these opportunities. Anyway, the first problem was irresponsible debt by consumers. The second one, I would argue, is poor corporate governance, particularly in the financial sector. Normally, in most organizations, when you have a board of directors, one of their main functions is to oversee the management of the enterprise and to be a bit of a check on the wisdom of the policies and initiatives that are being taken by management with regard to the health of that enterprise. Well, the United States, over time, that model has sort of broken down. And now you have, in many cases, situations where the CEO and other leading officers in the management of the organizations serve as the board chairs, and they sit on the board. They may even have a majority of the board. Well, there are always obvious conflicts of interest in that situation, not only in terms of what salaries are people going to be paid, but no one has the position stepping back from the organization of the enterprise or the business here, looking out for its health on behalf of the stockholders. That system basically broke down. And so with that failure in corporate governance, I would argue, financial institutions in particular, and others as well, took on too much risk, imprudent risk, just like the consumers had. Why did they do that? How did they do that? That leads to my third area in which blame might be leveled. That is the failure of the rating agencies. In the United States, there are three primary rating agencies. Let's see if I can name them: Standard & Poor's, Moody's, and Fitch. These are the guys who are supposed to dispassionately look at an investment instrument, a debt instrument, and make a judgment as to how risky it is. You may remember, and as long as any financial instrument is transparent and properly priced, it's fine. Some of you may remember, some of you older ones in the audience may remember back in the 1980s, there was something very popular called junk bonds. Well, junk bonds were very risky, but they promised a fairly high rate of return. And for many investors who had the wherewithal to take such risk, they bought those. Some failed and some didn't. This was a major means of financing many startup enterprises in the high-tech industry and others. Well, they were junk bonds. You knew what they were. They had a very low rating in terms of their risk by the credit agencies. That was fine. The problem was with these new instruments, for example, consolidated debt obligations, which were the packaging of these mortgage instruments, which, as we know now, had changed their nature from something very conservative, something actually quite risky. They were getting AAA ratings, the highest ratings available. Now, not only is that sort of misleads the market into what kind of thing we're talking about here, but the rules change. I spoke with someone from AIG, now the infamous AIG, and he explained that when AIG takes on these obligations, you know, they might be BBB or BBB plus or whatever, they have to set aside and reserve a certain amount of money to cover any losses that they might take depending on the level of risk in those instruments. If something is AAA, you don't have to keep any reserve because they are so risk-free that you don't have to provide for the possibility that they might go bad. So you can see where this is headed. Fourth is poor government oversight. There was, for the past 10 years or so, going back to the Democratic administration as well as the Republican administration, a weakening of regulatory bodies, both purposefully by policy and inadvertently, or at least less straightforward, by lack of funding so that they couldn't be fully staffed. Their feeling, if we'd have been talking about this 5 years ago, people would have been saying government should get out of the way of the market and let it do its thing. Let it do its thing. These new instruments were seen as adding value because they diversified the risk. Plausibly, a value added to the market. Fed Chairman Alan Greenspan believed in particular that companies did not need severe oversight because they would naturally police themselves. What company would not act in its own best interest? What company would take on more risk or get involved in activities that were not in the best interest, the prudent best interest of the company? Well, again, I've mentioned a couple of reasons why, in fact, that might have been allowed to happen. At any rate, you have at least these four areas. It's interesting to note that had any one of these groups done their job well, in hindsight, the crisis probably would have been averted. It didn't require everybody to do their job well. Conceivably, there were several ways in which this could have been prevented. None of them did their job well. Let me reiterate again that the economic effects are most severe in other places in the world than they are in the United States. And in those areas, there's a strong sense of injustice. What did we do wrong to deserve to have this happen to us? Okay, let's shift gears a little bit here and talk about U.S. leadership. What does U.S. leadership mean? What are the sources of strength that give us, as the United States, a competitive edge? Things that enable the United States to exercise leadership in the world. First, I would cite military power. Historically, that's just always been the case, that global or regional leadership has always been closely associated with military power. This is a topic about which we could talk about a lot, but not really what I want to focus on here. But let me state just simply that the United States remains by far the world's preeminent military power, and that's not going to change anytime soon. On the horizon are potential arrivals, increasing their capabilities, but nobody's close, and not going to be close for any time soon. However, what we've seen recently with terrorism and other things is that asymmetrical warfare undermines the ability of the United States' overwhelming military power to create a deterrent effect. They're not afraid of us because they feel like they've got ways to hurt us, despite the fact that we have overwhelming superiority in terms of conventional military arms. And then finally, on this point, note that military power in itself is not enough to have global leadership, as the experience with the Soviet Union dramatically shows. 2, economic power. Economic power is vital to support great military power, and it requires the rest of the world to pay attention to us because they need access to our market, which is by far the largest in the world. They need that. They can't ignore us. We are the world's biggest market. We'll continue to be the world's biggest market for some time to come. This bigness carries a lot of advantages. Just one small example. A week or so ago, I was speaking with a diplomat from Japan, and when the flu outbreak began in Mexico, he said that, of course, we have immediately canceled all of our direct flights to Mexico from Japan. And then he said, but of course, we won't do that with the United States because we'd lose too much money. So it makes a difference. 3, political power. In the global context, political power is best represented by the fact that we have veto power as a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council. We also exercise leadership in virtually every other international organization of consequence, the World Bank, NATO, the International Monetary Fund, and importantly, anywhere where we want to exercise leadership, even if we aren't currently. For example, the United States had very little role to play in the follow-up from the Kyoto Protocol because we sort of opted out for it. Now that the new administration is deciding to take a leading role in the climate change discussions internationally, immediately we're back up to the top. If we want to have an influence in some organization, we can get it. 4, the fourth area of source of our power is one that I think is often overlooked or taken for granted, not really thought about in these terms, but I think is enormously significant. That is the English language. If you look at who speaks the most languages around the world, I think Chinese is number 1, Brother Blair, Spanish number 2, English number 2, somewhere there. Those 3, Chinese, Spanish, and English, are the biggest 3. But that's not really the story, because in terms of what language is learned as a second language around the world, English is way ahead of everybody else. Let me give you a few examples. of the impact that this has. Some of you may be familiar with the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. This is Southeast Asia trying to get itself together and organize itself. As part of that effort, they wrote a song. There's the ASEAN, they call it not a hymn, they call it an anthem, the ASEAN anthem. So you've got these people from Burma, from Vietnam, from Brunei, from Laos, all singing the ASEAN anthem in English, even though it's not the native language of any of them. Maybe Philippines, maybe Singapore, but not really. So they're all singing English in a second language. That's the power of English around the world, because it goes on everywhere. Business transactions, English. International exchanges of all types. When the Japanese talk to the Chinese, they speak in English. When you look at tourism, virtually all hotels, airlines, travel agencies have an English capability anywhere in the world. When I speak with my Thai diplomatic colleagues in Thailand, their system requires that obviously they be very competent in their own language, Thai. Then they have to be completely fluent in English. And then they start looking at what foreign languages they will learn in order to have specialization in dealing with other countries. English is a given for everybody in the entire organization. Well, that's a big commitment and a big burden they have to take on to do that. We don't have to do that. We already speak it. It's a huge advantage. And the advantage itself isn't just the speaking of English, but the desire to speak English generates business, travel, educational exchange, all of which these activities redound disproportionately to the advantage of the United States and other native English-speaking countries. Okay, fifth, another big advantage that we have is the U.S. dollar as a world currency. Now, this is different but related to the fact that the United States enjoys great economic influence because of having the world's biggest market. The world, I was interested when I toured the, where they print the money back in Washington, D.C. What's that called? Mint? 80% of the dollars that are printed at the Mint immediately go overseas, not even used in the United States. The world trades largely in dollars. When Koreans need to buy Saudi Arabian oil, they use dollars. When Indonesia buys Chinese building materials, they pay in dollars. Most everywhere you go, prices are quoted in dollars. This role that the United States dollar has largely replaces the historic role that gold had. Importantly, this also gives the United States flexibility that no other countries have, delinking to a significant extent the relationship between interest rates and exchange rates, allowing the United States to pursue economic policies with greater flexibility that no one else can. In addition to that, as the dollar is perceived as a safe haven for wealth, the United States has this wonderful advantage of becoming richer whenever disaster, calamity, or fear strikes the rest of the world. Occurrences that make everybody else in the world poorer, because money flows into the U.S. dollar into the United States when times are tough. The current global economic crisis has undermined all of these advantages, especially the role of the dollar, but not that much. Not yet. The funny thing to Asians, when they look at this array of the sources of U.S. power, they are amazed to realize that Americans, having all these things, are not satisfied. That's not enough. We want more. What we want, in addition to all those things, which are kind of cold and insensitive, we also want moral authority. That's what really makes us feel good. That's what really makes us feel like our influence in the world isn't just for us, it's for the good of everyone. And by this, I mean something more broad than just doing the right thing or confidence in our judgment. It's the example set for the world by our institutions and our values. In terms of means of governance, we promote democracy. In means of economic organization, we have market capitalism. In terms of a way of life, we have freedom, including religious freedom. We have private ownership. In terms of justice, we have independent courts. In terms of a value system, we respect the rights and well-being of individual people. These are the sorts of things that, coming together, give us a certain moral authority in the world that is really important, I think, to Americans. My fear is that this particular strength, this particular source of American leadership and power, is at the greatest risk because of the global economic crisis. The global economic crisis isn't the first problem that started in the United States. You don't have to look back very far at all. The last one was the dot bubble crash earlier this decade. That started in the United States. But it was sort of clearly identifiable, and people understood the business cycle nature of it and how everybody was really excited about computer and internet possibilities and got a little over-exuberant, you know. But this one is different because of the sources of how it happened. It's caused people abroad to really stop and think, wait a minute, what really is the United States all about? If the judgment of U.S. consumers failed, if the management of U.S. companies, which was always thought to be so good, failed, if the regulatory and governmental bodies who are supposed to be watching over things didn't do their job, what's going on over there? It's very sobering. Is the United States just an empty giant? Let me hasten to point out that Asians do not want the U.S. to fail. But this is not from sentimentality. It's from very practical reasons. They need the U.S. market. They need the global trading system. They need safe shipping lines for their goods. These are all things that the United States provides. But despite that, there are questions being raised. It was mentioned in the introduction that I'm the United States permanent representative to, a long name here, the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific. Let me explain that just a little bit, because I'll bet you don't know what it means. Most people don't. Most people don't realize the United Nations has divided up the world into 5 regions. And those regions undertake a lot of discussion and programs and that, just like the United Nations General Assembly does in New York. And the one for Asia and the Pacific is based in Bangkok. And we have one of these big rooms with all the circular chairs and somebody up in front with all the flags and interpreters in the back and the walls, just like they do in New York. And SCAP, which is the acronym for this thing, includes more than 60 countries, ranging from Turkey to Vanuatu, from North Korea to New Zealand, a huge swatch of the world. Okay, last week, just before coming here, was the annual meeting of SCAP. Unsurprisingly, the global economic crisis was very much at the center of the discussions. And in the course of these discussions, let me share with you some of the questions that were raised, some of the calls from different countries in the course of various discussions and deliberations. There were calls for, and think about the implications of these things in terms of U.S. leadership and the world as we know it today, calls for reevaluation of the market system as a basis for world food production, and whether or not state planning ought to be given more of a role. There was a call for creation of an Asian 20 as a counterweight to the G20 of economically powerful countries that the United States dominates. There was a call on developed countries, like the United States, quote, who were responsible for the financial crisis, unquote, to make special compensation to the developing countries who have been most affected by it. There was a call for a move away from international trade, a belief that countries should not rely on other countries or any one currency. There was a call for strengthening of the Chiang Mai Initiative, which is an attempt by Asian countries to have an alternative to the IMF when there are foreign exchange difficulties. China and Japan have already committed to be major contributors to this new fund. Not all of these calls are well thought out, and I'm happy to report that none of them created a groundswell of support within ESCAP for implementation. But they're significant, and when you're watching what's going on in the world, you need to pay attention to what other people are thinking and what they're saying. Now, I don't think any of these things is going to change anything very quickly, very soon, but it's worth our paying attention to. Indeed, several times in the past, the United States' role in Asia has been called into question, and there have been dire predictions about what might happen. After the Vietnam War ended and the United States sort of pulled out of Vietnam, there were wide calls that the United States' influence in Asia would diminish and that of the Soviet Union might ascend. In the 1980s, Japan was number one, and they seemed to have an economic model that was, superior to others, and that the feeling was that the United States inevitably is not going to be able to compete like Japan will be able to compete in Asia. None of these things really panned out. There's a lot of talk today that China will take over the United States' preeminence in East Asia. Maybe. But we shouldn't be too quick to write off U.S. power and influence there. There was recently a study earlier this year of Asian elites, those who are in a position to make the decisions in a country and society, all across Asia, by the Center for Strategic and International Studies. The question they asked was, 10 years from now, what do you think Asia will be like? And the consensus among these Asian elites from all the countries was that 66% expect that China will be the strongest power in Asia. 31% felt it would continue to be the United States. The question was raised in 10 years, who would be the greatest threat to peace and stability in Asia? 38% said China, 21% North Korea, 13% the United States. However, when asked who will be the greatest force for peace and stability in Asia, 40% said the United States. 26% thought it would be China. There was broad consensus in this survey that Asia should have a stronger regional architecture, an East Asia community patterned loosely on the European Union, on the other side of the continent. But interestingly, when asked what other countries might and ought to be involved in that, 79% believe the United States should be part of the East Asia community. And perhaps more interestingly, 80% of the Chinese respondents agreed. Indeed, as the Prime Minister of Singapore, Lee Hsien Loong, pointed out recently, the rise in various capabilities and wealth and power of the countries in Asia isn't a zero-sum game. And indeed, there still is an important role for the United States to play, even as other powers in Asia grow. Well, I think a lot of discussion will be taking place in the next months and years on what the United States ought to do about all this. Let me just mention a couple of things. I believe, and have always felt from my experience abroad, that the greatest source of U.S. influence, of American influence in the world, really isn't our military or our policy or the positions we take or the badgering that we do of other people, other countries trying to get them to do the right thing. It is the United States as a source of inspiration and a focus for emulation for the rest of the world. We are most influential simply by being at our best. It may sound Pollyanna-ish, but actions speak louder than words. The CSIS survey, for example, found that, quote, there was remarkable support for the steady spread of the values of good governance, accountability, transparency, and democracy, end quote. Although we are not perfect, these are American strengths, and there's still great opportunity for us to continue to exercise influence, to the extent that we can model well these characteristics. It is also critically important in the near term that the United States not adopt protectionist policies. On this point, there was a groundswell in the SCAP meeting. Everyone is terrified of the idea that trade will be closed down with protectionist measures, similar to what happened in the Great Depression in the 1930s. No one is perfect in this regard. Every country has domestic pressures to erect barriers to trade to protect particular domestic constituencies. All of them do. The United States continues to be more open than almost all of them, but most of the rest of the country, as you recall from their dependence on exports, is vitally reliant on the fact of world markets remaining open. And they are clearly looking for the United States to lead in this effort to keep markets open. This is not going to be easy. The Obama administration came to power with a very ambitious agenda to do great things in many areas. Many of these things, however, whether it's initiatives for climate change, for labor and human rights, for public health, all of them, those who are behind them, realize that our source of greatest leverage is access to our market. And all of them are looking at ways to leverage that access to the market to promote their particular agenda. And we won't accept imports from a country that has too much air pollution, and stuff like that. All of it, none of it will be characterized as trade protectionism per se, but in the end, the result will be that. And the countries in Asia are watching very carefully to see how we manage this. And they will see very quickly through the noble end aims of these policies to realize the impact it's going to have on trade openness. Finally, I cannot leave the topic of U.S. leadership in the world without, for better or worse, talking about money. Just as a family budget reflects the values of that family, whether they put their money into savings for college accounts for their kids, whether they buy a used car or they really like new fancy cars, whether they spend money eating out and recreating, these all reflect the values of the family within their budget constraints. In the same way, the U.S. government, reflecting the desires of the taxpayers, manifested in who they choose to elect to Congress, how it spends its money on its international presence reflects the importance that we want to place on our leadership in the world. These discussions often don't generate a lot of headlines in the United States, but they are watched very closely in Asia and the rest of the world. Most obviously in this area, we're talking about foreign aid. I've not seen the most recent data, but I believe the United States probably remains the second largest provider of foreign aid in the world, next to Japan. But the United States economy is a whole lot bigger than other countries. And if you look at it on a per capita basis, how much is each individual American willing to pay for foreign aid? We are actually at the bottom of the list of developed countries in the world, something like number 17. People notice that. It may be sad but true that money gets access. I'll tell you a brief anecdote from my experience earlier on an earlier assignment in Bangkok. On my first assignment there, I was managing a narcotics assistance program where we gave money to the Thai to help them reduce the production of opium because we didn't want it turned into heroin and taken to the United States. And so we were providing money for helicopters to go cut down opium fields and all sorts of good stuff. When we had a problem, I remember one day we had a particular problem in the program that needed high-level attention very quickly. And I called on the phone the Director General of the Narcotics Suppression Board and explained the problem. He said, well, come right over. So I went right over there, discussed it with him, and we solved the problem right away. Later, I moved my job in the embassy to the economics section. And in there, I was in charge of the civil aviation policy, where we do deals on what airlines get to fly where and all that sort of stuff. And it was interesting to find out that the embassy, the ambassador, had made a request to call on the Director General of Civil Aviation, and it had been outstanding for 6 months. They hadn't even responded. We had nothing to give them. He wasn't looking forward to that meeting. Couldn't get it. Just fact of the matter is, money talks. People pay attention to those who can write checks. Next, support for international institutions and international presence. These sorts of funds are the most difficult to get Americans to get excited about. Paying money for the UN and all this sort of stuff. It's a very hard pitch to make. Let's look at the impact on it. In ESCAP, the organization that I'm the permanent rep to, most of the countries in the world to this annual meeting send their ministers to it to represent their countries. This year, the Korean trade minister offered to host next year's meeting. Even Laos sent its ministers there. China has a delegation of 8 diplomats led by an ambassador permanently stationed in Bangkok just to deal with the United Nations office there. The United States has me. And it's just actually a small part of my job. Most of what I do is dealing with Thailand's economy and that. This year we did get not a minister, not a cabinet-level officer from Washington, but we did get one mid-level staff person to come from Washington for the annual meeting. Last year, no one came. What is the message that that sends? The question is, how do we want to spend our money and how will that reflect the values? How will that reflect the things that we feel are most important in the world? What is U.S. leadership in the world worth to us? My point today is simply that, particularly in light of the global economic crisis, that is not something that we can take for granted. Thank you for listening. I'm happy to have any questions. Thank you. Okay. Anybody, like I said, if this was successful, it prompted you to be thinking and questioning. Any questions? Yes. I think you need to say who you are.
My name is Stephen.
Tell us what you're studying and where you're from.
I'm from Virginia, studying international relations. You've mentioned a lot about Asia and their viewpoint on the financial economic crisis. Any feeling for how other parts of the world are dealing with it? Are the others as affected as Asia or worse?
The part of the world that is being affected most traumatically is Eastern Europe. I'm not an expert on the area, so I can't delineate that exactly for you, but Russia, the former Soviet Union states, all the stands throughout the former Soviet Union, they are getting affected the worst. Exactly why that is, I can't explain. Every area of the world is getting hurt. Asia probably is the second greatest impact because they've been so dependent upon trade, and trade has taken such a hit. Yes, back here.
I'm from Southern California, and my question is, you brought up the language aspect, how the U.S. has an advantage with its mother language being English, and everybody is fluent in it, and all the other nations are learning that as another basic language, I guess. Is that changing? I mean, isn't that why we've created like the critical languages programs all across the U.S. to teach U.S. citizens all these foreign languages that are like Chinese, which is a rising power, and all these other things that we need in the future, or that we're thinking that we're going to need in the future in order to survive as a power, not the superpower?
Thank you. Very good point. Think about it just for a second. When you're sitting here listening as a native English speaker to someone whose native language is not English, it comes difficult to understand a little bit, even if they speak English. Well, imagine how difficult it is when two people are listening to each other, both of whom don't speak native English. The communication is difficult. Obviously, when you speak to people as well as you can in their native language, it goes better. I think that the effort to train Americans in foreign languages is simply in our own best interest. The more we can speak other people's languages, the better off we're going to be, the better we can pursue our interests. But that actually is a little different than what I'm talking about. To preserve and protect the advantage that we have nevertheless in English, we really ought to be doing more to promote the study of English around the world. Now, we used to do that a lot more than we do now. Back when the USIS, United States Information Service, used to have libraries and programs all over the world. Because of budget cutbacks and security concerns, we've retrenched a lot now, and they've begun to support more English language training around the world a little bit more now. But are there other countries that are vying for a piece of that pie? Absolutely. China has established a program called Confucian Institutes, modeled really on our old USIS program, where they're trying to set up these little centers for learning Chinese all around the world for obvious reasons. I think we got a little bit of advantage. I think Chinese is really hard. And English is not all that easy either, frankly, if you're a foreigner. But there's still we have a competitive advantage there. Most places in the world, if they had to choose between Chinese and English right now, they'd still choose English. But you got to have a program there. If the Chinese set up a Confucian Institute right around the corner, it's free, it's easy, it's scheduled when time is convenient, you might well go there. So to preserve that advantage to us, what we really need to be doing is investing more in the training of English around the world. And dovetailing with that very simply is bringing students to the United States to do their collegiate and graduate studies. That's a huge advantage. Virtually everyone that I deal with in the leadership of the Thai government studied in the United States. That's just such an advantage. We need to continue to promote that. We've retrenched a little bit on that because of concerns stemming from 9/11. It's really, the perception at least, is that it's really a hassle for foreigners to get a visa to come to the United States now. And, when we lose, we lose out, at least in that respect. And just a couple of years ago in Thailand, we there was a milestone in that the United States ceased to be the #1 foreign destination for Thai students. Australia took over, still recognizing that advantage of speaking English. But we lost it simply because they think it's too big of a hassle to get here. That's something we might want to look at as well. Yes.
My name is Joe Nelson. I'm from Texas. I'm studying physics. My question is, to what extent do you think the current global crisis is influencing the current unrest in Thailand?
I shouldn't make categoric statements, but 0. The unrest that's going on in Thailand now is very interesting from many perspectives. It is totally a domestic phenomenon. And it would be going on if the economy were going well. It's exacerbated maybe a little bit because when people become unemployed, they can march on the streets more freely and stuff like that. But the issues involved are not international at all. Without getting into why they're doing it, let's see if there are other questions. One more up front.
My name's Natalie. Is it on? Yeah. My name's Natalie Weissen. I'm pre-law, studying journalism and politics. This is a little bit off topic, but after living in the Asian countries and around there, how do you feel their progression is going in human rights?
In virtually every instance, possible exception of North Korea and Burma, human rights are getting better everywhere. And in virtually every state, they are not getting better as fast as we would like them to. And so we continue to raise it as an issue of great concern with the Chinese, with the Vietnamese, with others. But if you look at long-term trends, human rights in both those countries, for example, are so much better today than they were 10 years ago, and light years different than they were 30 years ago. So if you look at, the long-term trends, they're all positive, but it's not happening as fast as we'd like.
Is the United States playing a large role in that?
we're trying. It's a very difficult thing to play a role in because you get involved in very sensitive domestic politics when you start trying to intervene and tell governments how they should treat their people, because they have their own views on that. But and sometimes, we're probably a little overbearing when we talk about it, but we're never going to do enough when people are suffering. And so it's a very dicey, delicate political and diplomatic effort to do. Is that it? I guess that's it. Okay, thank you very much. I've enjoyed it very much and hope to get something out of it.